Well, thank you for attending California Bound, Opening the West 1840 through 1846. I'd like to start off by reading a passage from an overlander on the Oregon-California Trail. To enjoy such a trip along with such a crowd of emigration, a man must be able to endure heat like a salamander, mud and water like a muskrat, dust like a toad, and labor like a jackass. He must learn to eat with his unwashed fingers, drink out of the same vessel as his mules, sleep on the ground when it rains, and share his blanket with vermin, and have patience with mosquitoes who don't know any difference between the face of a man and the face of a mule, but dash without ceremony from one into the other. He must cease to think, except as where he may find grass and water and a good camping place. It is a hardship without glory to be sick without a home, to die and be buried like a dog. If you were one of the pioneers on the trail in the early 1840s, that was your daily life for 151.7 days. That's the time it took to get from Independence, Missouri to present-day Sacramento. Again, welcome. My name is Robert Keahey. I'm a docent at the Sunnyvale Heritage Park Museum. I encourage you, if you get a chance, come by and visit us. Tonight, we're going to get on the trail. We're going to spend some time trying to understand what one or more of those 151.7 days was like. But before we start, a little bit about me. I joined the docent team at the museum about 10 months ago. Got very interested in it. Now I'm going to tell you up front, I'm not a historian and I'm not a teacher. I hold a degree in computer science and mathematics. But one thing I do have is a boundless curiosity about stuff. So why a talk on westward migrations and why this specific time period? Well, for me, it was two things. One, when I joined the museum team, I realized I don't know much about California history, and I knew less about the pioneers that made the early migrations. And secondly, I grew up in the era of the interstate highway system development. And I remember my father talking about how dramatically it changed the way people could move from point A to point B. And I got to thinking about the pioneers and began wondering, were these the people that built the interstate highway system of their era? And we're going to explore that tonight. But most importantly, is we as society need to pay tribute to all of the early pioneers, not just the ones we know about, but all of them. And we need to make sure that their stories don't get relegated to the cosmic background noise of history. Our agenda tonight is very full. I'm going to take you on the trail, so hang on. We're going to look at the Western landscape in the early to mid-1800s. We're going to examine the key westward trails of the time. We're going to talk about the drivers that led to the Western migrations. We'll take a peek at what a migration may have looked like. We're going to talk about some of those notable migrations, and that's where we're going to get a feel for what those 151.7 days were like. Along the way, we're going to talk about actually a lot of the key players. And then I do have some suggested readings, and I'll cover those, but there's a handout on the table out there. And if we have time, we'll talk about some fun facts, maybe a little myth, legend, and lore. Now, given that we have a lot of ground to cover, no pun intended, I'm going to ask if you could hold your questions to the end. So to tell this story, we need to paint a picture. And the canvas I'm going to use for that story is the Western United States as we understand it today. And to that, I've added a couple of things. One is the boundaries, state boundaries, so you can have a point of reference. And the other is the major river systems, because these were the lifelines and the guideposts for the pioneers. To start our story, we turn back the clock to 1840, and we kind of look at a lay of the land. Now, this is just one picture. There are many. I'm sure you've had your own that you've seen before. But if you start over there on the right, you'll see the Wild West. And in 1840, Missouri was the Wild West. Once you crossed the Missouri River, you weren't in no man's land, but you were in unsettled territory. Going clockwise, you get the newly minted Republic of Texas, and that's disputed territory in between them and what's still owned by Mexico. Out there on the west is Alta California, which is part of Mexico at the time, and up in the northwest you have the Oregon Territory. And then you come on around to the north, which is the Indian country, and that was the official name given to it in 1830 by the US government. And then in the middle, you have this thing called the Great American Desert. And in 1820, Stephen Long would make an expedition into the West, and he would give it that name. So we're going to look at two primary trails tonight, the Santa Fe Trail and the Oregon Trail. The Santa Fe Trail ran 800 miles from Independence to Santa Fe, and then it actually went all the way down to Mexico City via the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, or the Royal Road of the Interior. And it really wasn't until 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase that it began to be used as a trade route. But in 1821, two things occurred. Missouri became a state and came under the protection of the United States, and Mexico got its independence from Spain, and they lifted the mercantile trade system, which was very restrictive. The trail actually ran all the way out to the west via the old Spanish Trail to Mission San Gabriel. And in 1829, a gentleman by the name of Antonio Armijo would take 30 mules across with goods and open a new route that was a little bit easier. It was still very hard. And then he started bringing mules and horses back. Many people don't know that Southern California at that time was a mecca for horses and mules, and bring them back to Missouri, and we have our Missouri mules. But in the early days, the period we're going to talk about, the Santa Fe Trail was really never adopted, and there were several reasons for it. One, there was no significant economic motivator, like we'll see with the fur trade and the Oregon Trail. It was very hostile territory, both from the territory itself and the Native Americans. The Apaches and the Comanches were very active protecting their territory, and it was very rugged and arid terrain. In fact, Leroy Hafen, an American historian of the West, termed it as the longest, crookedest, most arduous pack mule route in the history of America. And then there was always ongoing risk between Texas, Mexico, and the United States. If you decided to take that trail, you never knew who you were going to have to deal with along the way that might want to arrest you. The Oregon Trail can trace its roots back to the beginning of the fur trapping and trading industry in the Northwest in the late 1700s. And this really began with the Western migration push in the United States. And there were several major fur trapping and trading companies that were established. The Hudson's Bay in 1670, the American Fur Company in 1808 by John Jacob Astor. I'm sure you've heard that name. The Missouri Fur Company in 1809 by Manuel Lisa, and the Pacific Fur Company in 1810, and the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, which will be very important in a lot of this story, in 1822 by William Ashley and Andrew Henry. In the early days, the furs were typically taken to the Northwest, where you had trading posts established by the Hudson's Bay Company and by the Russians around Fort Ross. And you would put them on ships, and you would either take them around South America or send them to Asia. But as the westward migration continued in the United States, it made more sense to start bringing those furs east and start bringing supplies west. And in 1822, William Ashley of his fur trading company, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, forms what he calls the Ashley 100 Brigade. And his intent is to send 100 men up the Missouri River all the way to its headwaters, do the trapping, and use that as a route to bring furs back into the United States. Unfortunately, there were many uprisings with the Arikara Nation, and that threw a monkey wrench into that plan. So in 1824, he sends Jedediah Smith, a name we probably recognize, but then some others we might not, Thomas Fitzpatrick, Jim Bridger, and Etienne Provo, who Provo, Utah is named after. And his objective for them was to find a usable path through the Rocky Mountains. And they would discover what is known as the South Pass through the Rockies. And this led to the development of what we now know as the first leg of the Oregon Trail. In the early days, they basically used mules and hand carts to move goods along the Oregon Trail from Fort Hall back to the east and vice versa. In 1830, William Sublette, a trapper, fur trader, would be the first to bring a supply wagon all the way from St. Louis, Missouri, to the Wind River Rendezvous in the Rocky. The rendezvous is where the trappers would gather in the summertime. In 1832, Captain Benjamin Bonneville takes the first wagons through the South Pass. And in 1833, they hold the first of several trapper rendezvous in the Green River Valley. And this is where the trappers would come after they had trapped during the winter. They would congregate there in the summer, exchange their furs for goods, and then have a good time. And then in 1840, Robert Newell and Joe Meek would take wagons all the way up to the Columbia River. So this led to the establishment of a viable route that we now know as the Oregon Trail. So now let's talk about some of the early trailblazers. A lot of these names you may recognize if you've done any amount of history, but there are several that will play a role in our discussion tonight. Gentlemen like Jim Bridger, James Kleiman, Caleb Old Greenwood, we were talking about him early. He was 81 years old at the time of our story. Isaac Hitchcock, Elijah Stevens, Louis Vasquez, and Joseph Walker, to name a few. The gentleman on the right is a trapper by the name of Old Bill Williams. This was pretty typical of what these gentlemen look like. Now, we think of them in clean, beautiful buckskins. That was not the case. These gentlemen were pretty rank. They would skin the beavers, rub their hands on their buckskins. They would get the castoreum oil out of the beavers. They'd rub it on their buckskins, and they would literally turn black. The good news is it made them rainproof for them. But they were pretty rank guys. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the other early pioneers that we don't think about. And these were the missionaries that made the early trips into the West. The Whitmans and the Spaldings, who in 1836 would go to Washington and Idaho. Father Pierre Jean de Smet, and then with Gregorio Mingerini and the noted artist Nicholas Point, would in 1841 go into the Dakotas, and then in 1842 Dr. Elijah White would take a wagon train into Oregon. Now, quite controversial as he was, he did lead an initial group of wagons into Oregon. So now let's talk about what made these people go west. And we're going to put this in two contexts. One is what I call what pushed them there, and the other is what pulled them there. And we're going to talk about this in pre-gold rush terms, because we know in the spring of 1848, when James Marshall discovers gold, all bets are off after that. So on the push side, these people were just transient by nature. I mean, the country had been moving west for a couple of hundred years already, and there was an endless boundary of land out there that they could go discover. And there was a love of the wilderness. I mean, the eastern part of the United States was starting to get a little bit crowded. There was a need for virgin land. As they continued to farm the land and didn't till it, it became sterile. And they got tired of what they call stump grinding, trying to clear land for new crops. There was onslaughts of disease, especially along the Missouri and Mississippi River. Malaria was prevalent in the early 1840s. And in 1837, the financial crisis was still in effect. There was still a depression, and many people were looking to escape the financial burdens in which they were under. The Preemption Act of 1841, this was kind of the first government move to try to get people to go west, because guess what? We were worried about the British and the Russians even back then, but it wasn't really until about 1850 that acts really motivated people to go west. And then there was just the U.S. expansionism and manifest destiny. If you're familiar with John L. O'Sullivan and his 1845 article coining the term manifest destiny, the land was there and it's ours to take. On the pull side, there was this myth of disease-free California. And for the most part, it was until the white people showed up. And then we pretty much devastated the native populations. There was a promise of free land. There were massive land grants given by the governors of Mexico up until about 1840. In fact, there were 493 of them that totaled about 6.5 million acres of land. And that ended up in the hands of about 800 wealthy landowners. And once they owned that land, they needed to monetize it because they needed something to keep them financially stable. Well, with the decline of the fur trade and the failure of Mexico to colonize California and the secularization of the missions, they were looking for people to come help turn that land into money for them. There were marketing people like John Sutter and Dr. John Marsh, who had a special interest in bringing people west. And then, of course, there was the romantic aspect of authors like Cooper and Irving. So let's look at a typical Western migration. And I say typical because there really is no typical Western migration when you look at it. But we'll start with the demographics of who these people were. A lot of them were looking for religious freedom. Believe it or not, that was still an issue, and especially for one of the parties, the Stevens Townsend Murphy party, the Murphy family of Sunnyvale. Religious freedom was important. Some of them were entrepreneurs. They saw this as a great opportunity to make lots of money out west in this land of gold. Some of them were looking for political or power ambitions, and we'll talk about one of those in a little bit. Some were fleeing prosecution. This was quite common. Some of them were just simply adventurers. They just wanted to go see what was over the next horizon. For some, like the Teamsters and the Drovers, who would go with the wagon trains, it was simply a job. And if you looked at them on a scale, some were very educated and to very illiterate. And they were from benign to, unfortunately, very barbaric in some cases. Your transportation, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. When you make that move from Mountain View over to Saratoga, it's a big deal. If you were moving from Missouri to Sutter's Fort, or which is now Sacramento, this was your moving van. Now, if you were lucky, you might have two of them, but it was a farm wagon. It was not the big Conestoga that we think about. They were pulled by 2 or 3 yokes of oxen, and a yoke being 2 oxen. They used oxen because, one, they were cheap compared to mules and horses, and they had stamina. They could pull large loads a long distance. The typical wagon would weigh about 1,500 to 2,000 pounds. You would carry limited spare parts because weight was critical. The mantra was, if it breaks on the plains and you can't fix it, you don't need to be on the plains. And the wagons were for goods, not people. We also talked about this a little earlier. The only people that got to ride in the wagons were the very young, the very old, and I mean very, or the very sick. Other than that, if you were a man, you probably got to ride a horse. If you were a woman or a child, you walked. Your minimum food manifest, this is just an example, but the goal was to take things that would preserve. Now, one of the delicacies was bacon. You'll read a lot about people who had their bacon with them, but that was kind of dicey, trying to take bacon all the way across the plain. But for the most part, it was bread products, flour, those types of things that you would eat along the plain, beans, etc. And then you were definitely dependent on whatever game you could kill along the way. You wanted to take as much as you could with you because when you got out on the plains, stuff wasn't cheap. John Bidwell in 1841, when he goes across the plain, he records when he gets to Port Hall, a cup of sugar cost $1. $1 in 1841 is worth $39.50 today. So you had to be prepared. As far as other basic necessities, a lot of blankets. You can read the list. I'm not going to read it to you. But the things at the bottom were very critical. The chains, the ropes, the anvils, the things that you needed to get yourself out of trouble. And then along with that, you would probably take some number of cows and sheep for food. And with the hope, if you made it to California, you would sell them for a profit. So we've got our wagon, we've got it loaded, we're ready to jump off, let's hit the trail. So we would do a departure, and you would optionally form a society or a company. And the purpose of this was an expensive endeavor. And so they would form a society, they would actually sell shares in those society on margin, and then in exchange for that, you could get goods at a reduced cost, with the idea that once you reached California, you're going to pay back your loan, hopefully. From there, you would choose a jumping off point, typically Independence or Council Bluffs, one of those cities along the Missouri River that joined another river. You'd pick a date, you would advertise your intentions in one or more of the newspapers, and then you would gather up a bunch of participants. And they were typically a joint Oregon-California migration. Very seldom did you just see one party start out on its own just to go to either place. They were typically a joint. You would elect a leader. I can assure you that was a contentious process because it never went smoothly, and quite often they would elect numerous leaders along the trail because they would have falling outs. And then you would head out on a journey marked by heat, cold, rain, storms, endless river crossings, inhospitable land, very hostile territories, lots of disease, cholera, scurvy, etc., shortage of food and water, more river crossings. You never ended up, rivers were always there. Lack of direction, as we'll talk about with the Bidwell-Bartleson party, dissension among the parties, and sometimes just total anarchy. And that was just the first 100 miles of the trip. And you had 1,900 miles to go. So now let's look at some of those migrations. We'll start by looking at the Bidwell-Bartleson party, and here's where we're going to kind of get on the trail. And we'll look at their 1841 migration. And then we're going to actually look at an eastbound one because those were important too. People did come back once they reached California or Oregon, and they came back for numerous reasons. Then we'll look at the Childs-Walker Party of 1843. We're going to talk about the Stevens-Townsend-Murphy Party of 1844, our family at the museum. And then in 1845, we're just going to do a summary, and then we're going to talk about, in 1846, the Hastings cutoff parties. This is kind of one that I think most people may have kind of heard about, may have heard how it affected people. We're going to dive into it. So, Bidwell-Bartleson Party of 1841. John Bidwell was a 21-year-old school teacher from Westport, Missouri, goes to St. Louis to buy some school supplies for his kiddies, come back, and a squatter has taken his land. Given the fact that at that time he wasn't 21, he had no legal right to the land, so he had nowhere to go. So he decides to head west. And he hears about California from a trapper by the name of Antoine Robideau, who is carrying some letters from that guy named John Marsh that I mentioned earlier, one of those marketing guys. He, along with a guy by the name of John Bartleson and Talbot Green, some of you may have heard that name before, but if not, I'll share a little bit about him at the end, form the Western Immigration Society and get a great group of people together. And then some bad news comes back from the West Coast by a guy by the name of Farnham, and those numbers dwindle. But they still have about 50 people that decide that they're going to go west. So they head out and they leave from a place called Sapling Grove, right around Independence, on May 12th with 14 wagons. And interestingly enough, there's a gentleman with him by the name of James Springer. Now, some of you who live here in Saratoga may recognize that name. There's a house, 1852, the Springer House. It's the oldest wooden structure still standing after the Murphy House was torn down in 1961. But he settled here in Saratoga and was an assemblyman and planted some orchards. So you definitely have a connection. So they would head out. They would head up the Kansas River, the Blue River. Along the way, they would pick up this guy by the name of Joseph Childs and Father Pierre John de Smet that I mentioned, and a guy by the name of Thomas Broken Hand Fitzpatrick. These guys had colorful names. He was firing a pistol, it exploded, pretty much screwed up his hand for life. Their first stop would be at Fort Laramie, that was founded in 1834 by William Sublette, and this would be a supply post. Really wasn't a fort in the common sense that we think about, but that's what they called them. From there, they would head on west, go through a place called Independence Rock, which is of interest. We'll talk about a little later. And then they would head through the Green River Valley up to a place called Soda Springs. And this is where they would have this water that was effervescent. It had a lot of carbonation in it, and they said it kind of tasted like beer. From there, you would typically head on up to Fort Hall and resupply. But for whatever reason, the Bidwell Partisan Party decides that they're going to head out on their own, much against the advice of Thomas Fitzpatrick, who says, you don't know what you're doing. I can't go with you. I'm going to take the rest of these people to the Dakotas. Don't do it. You're going to hurt yourself. But they head out. They head down right north of the Salt Lake City. They get to a place called Rabbit Springs, and they realize they're already out of food and getting very low. So they abandon their first set of wagons. They go on down to the base around Pilot Peak. They abandon another set of wagons. They go to the base of the Pequot Mountains, and they abandon the last of their wagons. So now they're on the eastern side of what we now know as Nevada, and they have only what they can carry on the back of their oxen and mules. And oxen are not good pack animals. Mules are pretty good, oxen are not. So they head on west. They go down the Humboldt River, and they reach the Humboldt Sink. The Humboldt Sink is where water disappears. In fact, this whole area of the Southwest is known as a Great Basin, and it's where water just goes in and never comes back out. The Humboldt Sink is 4 miles wide, 11 miles long, and it's nasty. In fact, James Clyman, a frontierman coming through there in 1846, would describe it as clay or mud, which, as his spelling was kind of bad, vomited from the bowels of the earth mixed with scalding water. The water was very alkaline, very hard to drink. From there, they can see the Sierra Nevada mountains. They can see this big monolithic mass in front of them, and they're not sure where to go, so they start heading south around Walker River and Walker Lake. And on October 15th, they decide it's now or never. We've got to make a decision. So they head into the Sierra Nevada mountains around the present-day Sonora Pass. On October 18th, they kill one of their last oxen. And then around October 22nd, they kill their last one. And on October 30th, they reach the summit of the Sierra Nevada mountains at 9,425 feet. And they are out of food. But through perseverance, they make it over to Marsh's Fort at present-day Mount Diablo on November 5th. But unfortunately, they're destitute at that point. All their goods are pretty much gone, no wagons, etc. And their journey was about 2,000 miles. So now, Joseph Childs, that guy they picked up on the trail, he's a pretty smart guy. He's one of those entrepreneur guys. He sees that there's an opportunity in this great state of California to make some money because there's no milling capability, either wheat or lumber. So he decided he's going to head back, and this guy, John Bartleson, joins him. Now, if you remember, Bartleson was just going west. When they were in the Sierras, he said, Lord, if you let me survive this, I will go back to Missouri and eat out of the pig troughs if I have to. So he didn't stay very long in California, and he decides to head back. 11 other men join him. Their jumping off point is Sutter's Fort, built in 1841 by John Sutter, an immigrant from Switzerland. Somewhat of a shady past. Walked out on his wife and 5 children. Apparently had some bank money problems that he had there. And he comes to California and he gets a 48,000 acre land grant from Juan Bautista Alvarado, the governor of Mexico at the time. This is their jumping off point. They decide they're going to take Walker's Pass, which was opened in 1834 by a trapper called Joseph Walker. So they head south and they miss it by about 100 miles. And they end up at the Tejon Pass. Now, the question is, and a lot of historians will ask this question, but most of them, it's mixed. Say, why didn't they just take the Santa Fe Trail east? Well, a lot of reasons. There was no clear marker. There was no road sand. You had to go through the Mojave Desert. The trail would disappear. So they made the decision they're going to head back up the east side of the Sierras, go back up the Humboldt River, because at least they know where that is. Go back to Fort Hall, go back up. Fort Hall, which was founded in 1837 by a guy by the name of Nathaniel Wyeth with the Hudson's Bay Company. And they head into the Green River Valley where the trappers are meeting. The trappers tell them, probably don't need to go east. The Sioux Nation is on the uprise. You better make different plans. So they leave 3 of their guys there and the rest of them head south through the Green River, through the Colorado River to Santa Fe. They pick up the Santa Fe Trail and head back to Missouri. And on September 9th, 9 men on horses reach their destination. Trip of about 3,000 miles. Joseph Childs, this guy was active. So remember, I said he saw an opportunity in California. He said, I'm going to make some money. So he and a guy by the name of Joseph Walker, remember that guy, Walker Pass, they are going to go back west in 1843. Now, Childs has a business associate by the name of William Baldridge. He's a heavy machinery dealer. So in May, the end of May, in Independence, Missouri, they load up 8 wagons with heavy machinery. Now remember I said 1,500 to 2,000 pounds, you need to take a lot of food. Okay, they loaded these wagons up with machinery and they head out. Same path that you've seen before. And at Fort Laramie, they pick up Joseph Walker, who now agrees to guide them on west. So they head on down through the Green River to Fort Bridger, which has been established. They head up to Soda Springs and they get to Fort Hall. And of course, by this time, they are short on food. Now, there's a gentleman at the at Fort Hall by the name of Richard Grant. He's the post commander, and he works for the Hudson's Bay Company, who's owned by the British. And the British don't want people coming west. So he refuses to give them any food. He finally relents, gives them 4 cows. They head on over to the Portneuf River, where's the jumping off point. And about 10 men in the party say, this is not going to work. They go back to Fort Hall, and by what's described as less than friendly means, they convince Grant to give them some more food. But it's still not enough. So they make a decision. They're going to split their party. And on September 17th, the party splits. Some men on horseback head up to Fort Boise. The plan is they're going to go up into California, go to Sutter's Fort, get some supplies, come back over the Sierras, bring the rest of the party over, and it's going to be really smooth sailing. They head down, and they actually don't reach Sutter's Fort until November 10th. So they're way behind schedule. This is a very arduous trip they've taken. And unfortunately, the snow has already closed the Sierra Nevada mountains by this time. So there's no way they can take supplies back east to help Walker. Walker, in the meantime, heads out. He goes down the Humboldt River. He's actually been down this route in 1834 with Captain Benjamin Bonneville, so he at least knows this route. He gets to the Humboldt Sink. The plan is that Childs would bring supplies back over. He realizes pretty quickly that's not going to happen. So he heads on down south because he knows Walker Pass is down there and he knows he can get through it. Right about Owens Lake, they're out of food. So they decide to abandon their wagons, which is kind of the norm. And what they do is they actually take all of that heavy equipment and they bury it in the desert. And this was known as caching, and this was a common process on the trail. You would realize you were in trouble, you would dump stuff out, you would bury it, and you planned to come back and get it. One of the great parts of the trails today is trying to determine where those caches were, because they were very common. But they managed to head on through Walker's Pass, and in an ironic twist of fate, Childs realizes, by agreement, that this is what they're going to do. He sends out a rescue party to go meet them, and they bypass each other by one day. On January 1st, 1844, they end up in Peachtree Valley, just like their predecessors, pretty much starved. But they made it, and unfortunately, no wagons. And the total combined journey for these parties was about 3,000 miles. Now we're going to talk about the Stevens, Townsend, Murphy party, my party. It was made up of three principals: Elijah Stevens. So I'm sure you guys have probably crossed Stevens Creek more than once. Stevens Creek is named after Elijah Stevens, 1804, an old government blacksmith, crusty old guy, ends up as a beekeeper down in around Bakersfield. He's their guide. Dr. John Townsend, a licensed physician from Philadelphia, so this is very important. And Martin Murphy Sr., the devout Irish Catholic family who had moved from Ireland to Canada to Missouri and now has made the decision to move to California. So on May 13th, they leave with their 11 wagons. They're in a larger party of 27 wagons going to Oregon, 27 in total, 11 of which are Stevens, Townsend, Murphy. They make it to Fort Laramie in record time. And I'd like to point out here, we think about the mountains and the desert as being deadly. But this first part of the trail was just as deadly. And in 1844, it was a record rainfall year. John Minto of the Oregon-bound Gilliam Party would record that on the first 60 days of the trail, it rained 52 days. At one point, it rained 11 days straight. And the Missouri River on around June 15th would crest 5 feet above the historic 1826 flood, and the Mississippi River would crest 4 feet above the incredible 1785 flood. It was miserable, but through the persistence of Mr. Stevens, they made record time averaging 20 miles a day. The Thorpe party didn't like them. They headed on west. They stopped at Independence Rock, and Independence Rock was a big rock in the ground that just sticks up. It's about 1,950 feet long, 850 feet wide, and about 350 feet tall. In 1830, William Sublette and some trappers stopped there on the July 4th, and he names it Independence Rock. And they take out their knives and hatchets and they start carving their names in that rock. And it's known as today as a registration rock, because after that, all the parties coming through would carve their names in this rock. And you can go there today and see names dating all the way back to the 1840s and 1850s. Also significant about this is one of the party members of the 50 members of the Stevens, Townsend, Murphy party, Mary Miller, gave birth to a baby, and they named her Ellen Independence Miller in honor of being born on the 4th of July at Independence Rock. From there, they would typically go to Fort Bridger, but based on advice from Isaac Hitchcock, the old trapper that was with them, they took a shortcut, which led them up to the Bear River and up to Fort Hall, and they actually ended up saving about 3 to 5 days of their trip, even though it was very arduous because that was a stretch of desert known as the Little Colorado Desert. They would head on down the Humboldt River, and here, believe it or not, even though they've got Elijah Stevens, Caleb Old Greenwood, who was another fur trapper and trader, and the reason he was called Old is in 1844 he was 81 years old, and Isaac Hitchcock. None of them had ever been this far west. So they're standing there at the Humboldt Sink, which we described earlier. Horrible place. And they're looking out across and they see the Sierra Nevada mountains. And they're like, well, we think we need to go this way, but we're not exactly sure. So they meet an old Paiute chief. Now, Caleb Old Greenwood had spent almost all his life in the Dakota territories amongst the Crow Indians. In fact, he married a Crow Indian woman named Batchika. They would have 7 children together. And he knew enough Native American language words, and he knew some sign language. And by drawing pictures in the sand, this chief called Truckee was able to tell them that if they go about 40 miles ahead, they'll find a river. And that river will take them into the Sierra Nevada mountains. And that chief's name is Truckee, and you know the Truckee River and Truckee, California. Truckee came from the word Truckee in Paiute, which means okay or all is good, and he repeated that over and over and over. So they nicknamed him Truckee. So they head up the Truckee River. It takes them about 30 days to get to what's now Donner Lake. They went up the river in the water because, as you know, the Sierra Nevada mountains are extremely rugged. So their only route up was in the river. This softened the hooves of the oxen to the point where by the time they reached Donner Lake, they only had enough oxen left to pull 5 wagons out of the 11. So they make the decision that they're going to leave 6 of their wagons there and take the others over the summit. They also make a decision that 6 members of the party are going to split and go into Sutter's Fort and try to bring some provisions back. And the rest of the party on November 25th goes to the summit after an arduous drive. If you've ever been to Truckee and you've looked at Donner Lake and you look up at the mountains, that's where they went. And at this time, there's 2 feet of snow on the ground. They get to the summit, they hit a granite wall, and they don't know how to get across. They're stuck at the summit. Caleb Old Greenwood manages to find a little narrow passage through this 10-foot granite wall. They unhitch their oxen, take them through. They unload their wagons, carry all their goods through to the other side. Then they take chains, remember those chains I told you about? They run them back over the summit and pull the 5 wagons over the summit. First pioneers to bring wagons into California, November 28, 1844. From there, they go on about 15 miles down to Big Bend and camp at what's known as Bear Camp today. And remember the 6 wagons? Well, they actually built a small cabin at Donner Lake, and the plan was 3 guys, Joseph Foster, Alan Armstrong, and a young 17-year-old boy by the name of Moses Schallenberger were going to stay there and wait for the party to come back and rescue them. Well, they build this cabin. It's already snowing. After about a week, the drifts are now about 10 feet deep, and they say, not a good idea. So they try to head to the summit. Young 17-year-old Schallenberger can't make it. So he decides that he's going to go back, stay in the cabin, and the other 2 gentlemen will go over the summit and join the party, the rest of the party at Bear Camp. So this is the 1st of December. They break camp. The men of the camp break camp, 17 of them, take all the cattle, go down to Sutter's Fort with the intent of getting supplies, come back up into the Sierras and rescue the rest of their family. So now, about a week after the party of 6 arrived, which has 4 men in it, this party arrives with 17 men, And John Sutter, remember that guy I mentioned? He says, welcome, you're now part of my army. Well, at that time, there was an uprising between the governor, then governor of Mexico, and the former governors, and they were trying to depose Manuel Micheltoreno, the current governor. And Mr. Sutter was aligned with him, so he conscripts these 21 men into his army, and they spend about the next month chasing Alvarado around central California. Nothing happens. No shots are fired. In fact, Micheltoreno is sick most of the time and has to be hauled around in a wagon. And about mid-January, the men of the party decide, our family is in the Sierras. We need to do something. So they head back into the Sierras, and they find their family in around mid-February. Believe it or not, all of them are alive. I can't say they're well, they're hungry. The Elizabeth Patterson family and her 5 children were down to boiling leather to make the soup out of, just like the Donner Party did. But they were all alive. And they take them down, and a gentleman by the name of Dennis Martin goes back over the Sierras, finds young Moses Schallenberger, who's now been in this cabin almost 3 months by himself, living off what he could trap, which is mostly foxes. But he's alive and well, brings him over the summit. And around March 1st of 1845, they finally reach their destination, which is the Bear River. Unfortunately, it's flooded, and they have to wait another 2 weeks. But they made it. First family over. A lot of firsts for the Stevens, Towns, and Murphys. First to use multiple guides. First to take this cut off. First to build this permanent structure in the Sierras, which would actually be used by the Breen family in the Donner Party in 1846. First to find a wagon passage over the Sierras, which would be used by several parties in the following years. First to bring wagons into California, survived a winter. I forgot to mention one thing. While they were at Bear Camp, Mary Bolger Murphy gave birth to a daughter also. So they left Council Bluffs, Iowa, with 50 people, arrived in California with 52 people. And they were the first to go back over the Sierras to try to gather their belongings. 1845, I mentioned, we'll just look at this very high level. There were a few parties that showed up. The McMay and Kleiman came down from Oregon. That was quite common for Oregon parties to head down to California. The Swayze Todd and Snyder Blackburn would use the route that the Stevens, Townsend, Murphy set. Solomon Sublette, a trapper, one of the 5 Sublette brothers, would bring a party of 15 men on horseback. Grigsby I. Greenwood, remember old Caleb that I mentioned? Sutter hired him to go back over the Sierras, back to Fort Hall, find more people, bring them over, and paid him $2.50 a wagon to bring settlers into California, as opposed to Oregon. And then Fremont's 3rd expedition. We've all heard of John C. Fremont, his numerous expeditions. He had just finished his 3rd expedition, and this will become very important. And then a gentleman by the name of Hastings showed up with 10 men on horseback. 1846 was coined the year of complexity by historian Dale Morgan, and there's a reason for that. If you look at the count of wagons, we've now got well over 550 wagons headed out of St. Joseph and Independence, Missouri. And this is where the shift from Oregon to California occurs. You really start seeing the bulk of the people headed to California. There are numerous expeditions or different parties, where before there was typically maybe 1, 2, or 3. Now there's 20 and 30 different parties, different destinations, all different types of leaders and different mindsets of how to get there. There was this new mix of characters. The fur trapping industry ended around 1840 because the fad of beaver hats went out of favor. Now it was the plumed hats. So these mountaineers were looking for work. There were authors and journalists that were now making this trip west to document it. Promoters, I mentioned, the guys that were already out there, but there were guys like Hastings and Hudspeth and Jesse Applegate. And then there were some like of unique character, like Lilburn Boggs, the 6th governor of Missouri, was now headed west, or George McKinstry, the first American sheriff, would become the first American sheriff in California. 2 new passes were opened through the Sierras, the Roller and the Coldstream, which made it less hard. I'll say it didn't make it easier, it made it less hard than the route that the Stevens, Townsend, Murphy party took. And then you had the beginning of the return migrations. Remember I said people did come back. You were actually starting to see this in quite large numbers by this time. People came out here, wasn't everything they thought it was, started heading back. And this began the era of the letters home. And these would be sent back east. They would be published in newspapers, and some of them are amazingly interesting to read about what people endured on the trail. And our last trail is what we're going to talk about is what I call tragedy on the trail, and it's the Hastings cutoff. And so I need everybody to get out a piece of paper and a pencil, and we're going to take a pop quiz. So which of these parties crossed the Hastings cutoff? It's easy, all of above. But as Jess Peterson in his 2018 Overland Journal article wrote, as a rule, whenever the subject of the Hastings cutoffs is mentioned, people think of the Donner Party, and they don't think of the others. And in fact, it was quite interesting in terms of the number of people. There were over 100 wagons, and there were over 400 people that made this crossing. So it wasn't just the Donner Party. And we were having a discussion on the Donner Party a little bit earlier before we started, and we know the problems they had all along the trail. But in my opinion, this is what sealed their fate. So to tell this story, we really have to put it in the context of a saga, and it begins with a gentleman by the name of Lansford W. Hastings. He was a young 21-year-old lawyer in the early 1840s, and he is very ambitious. Remember I said on those demographics, these people that were interested in political power and control? He was one of them, definitely. And so in 1842, he heads to Oregon with that Elijah White party. He was actually captain of that party for a while and goes on to Oregon. But he gets there and he's not satisfied because he doesn't see it as an opportunity. So in 1843, he heads down to Sutter's Fort that we talked about earlier, and he meets and works for John Sutter. He actually helps him lay out a town called Sutterville. He himself obtains a small land grant, and the reason being is he sees what Sutter's up to. While Sutter may have had visions of establishing a monarchy, Hastings had visions of setting up a republic with him as president. That's kind of the belief. So he felt it critical that he had some land. In 1843, he decides to go back east and he sails to Mexico. And you think, why Mexico? Well, the rumor is it, and this was never established as fact, but the rumor is that he was going to stop in Mexico City, meet with the Mexican government and say, hey, come on guys, you need to give us this land. You're not doing anything with it. And then he was going to run up to Texas and talk to Sam Houston and say, Sam, how did you do that? Tell me what I need to do. Neither of those ever occurred, but it's a good story. In 1844, he arrives in St. Louis, and then he immediately writes a letter to Secretary of State John C. Calhoun. And he says, John, we're not happy out there in California. This is a great opportunity for us to take control of that territory. You're sitting on your thumbs back here on the East Coast. If you don't get your act together, we're kind of going to do some revolutionary type stuff. Calhoun ignores him because, as you know, in 1844, Polk is elected, and one of Polk's 4 policies is go take everything west that you can. So it was already a kind of an ordained deal. And so instead, he decides to write a book. And he writes what is known as the Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, and he publishes this in 1845. And some of you may have heard of this book, maybe? Anybody? No, probably not. So this was his way of trying to entice people to come west. And it's 155 pages long. I've read it. He basically portrays the Mexican people as illiterate, lazy, and basically says, come on out here. This is land for the taking. it's pretty much panned by everybody. I mean, there's maybe 10 pages in there that gives some advice on what it actually takes to make a migration. The rest of it is just him pontificating. There are two passages, though, here that are very controversial and have been argued for well over 170 years now. One was, he said, wagons can be readily taken from Fort Hall to the Bay of St. Francisco, that was how it was known at the time, as they can from the States to Fort Hall. And in fact, the latter part of the route is found much more eligible for a wagon than the former. The only problem is he's never taken that route. And then the other passage is the most direct route for the California immigrants would be to leave the Oregon route about 200 miles east from Fort Hall, thence bearing southwest to the Salt Lake, and thence continuing down the bay to the Bay of St. Francisco by the route just described earlier. And this is what will become the Hastings Cutoff. The only problem is he's never taken this route either. He's never set foot on it. So he was writing about stuff he knew nothing about. He goes on a promotion tour to the east, Ohio, New York, and he meets a gentleman by the name of Sam Branham, who positions himself as a publisher and the president of the Mormons of the East. And Branham tells Hastings that I'm going to put 250 people on a boat, send them around the Horn, and bring them into California, and I need some place for them to go. And Hastings says, I have some land, and I'll let you build a settlement on that land. So he hightails it back to St. Louis in August, gets 10 men on horses, and heads west to Sutter's Fort, leaving in August. This was insane. They make it to Fort Hall. They are totally starved. They get a few provisions. They head out again. They make it to the summit of the Sierras, make it over the Sierras. The day after they make it over the summit, the Sierras are closed by a massive snowstorm. Mother Nature could have dealt us a better hand and not let them over, and we may have never heard of this story. The saga actually has a few other players. James Hudspeth is a nice man that Hastings met in California. He was an old mountaineer. Jim Bridger. Jim was probably one of the, if not the most famous mountaineer. You've probably heard of the Revenant and may have heard Jim Bridger in that story, and Hugh Glass. And then Edwin Bryant, a journalist from Kentucky. He was a newspaper editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal. He was heading west because he was one of those ones that wanted to document this story. And he was trying to improve his health. That was quite common. People thought if they went west, they could improve their health. In fact, there was the story of the gentleman in California that lived to be 250 years old. He died while out of state. His family brought him back to California. He lived again. That's how good the climate was out here. So in January and March of 1846, a couple of fateful meetings may have occurred. Now you're going to hear me say may in a lot of this stuff because there's no documented record of this actually occurring. But one is that, remember I told you that John C. Fremont shows up at Sutter's Fort in December of 1845, about the same time Hastings does. Fremont goes on down south looking for Theodore Talbot, who's bringing the rest of his group around the southern trek around the Sierras. But in January, he comes back to Sutter's Fort, and it's believed that Fremont and Hastings had a meeting, and Fremont tells him about this new path he's discovered south of the Salt Lake, Great Salt Lake. So remember in Hastings' book, he described this path. Fremont has now confirmed that there is a path there. And then in March, Talbot shows up and he gets to talk to him. Now in the meantime, Sam Brannan is delayed, so Hastings decides to go to Oregon, but after he talks to Talbot, he changes his plan and heads east. Now I said may a lot of this, but what we do know is that in June of 1845, Fremont did publish an article in the Western Expository saying, I think there's a route 300 to 400 miles shorter. So that planted a seed. In 1846, in a letter to his wife, he references a much shorter route, writing language that says, instead of a barren country, the mountains were covered with grasses of the best quality, more deer and mountain sheep than we had seen in any previous part of our voyage. So he was describing this new route in eloquent terms. In 1846, I mentioned Hastings changes his plans. In April, he heads east. And in June, we have quite a few references of Hastings using Fremont's name to advertise his new route. So, April 11th, they head out. Hastings heads east. He meets up with a trapper named James Clyman. Remember that guy that I told you about, the Humboldt Sink? Caleb Old Greenwood's going east again. And then James Hudspeth, who I mentioned. They head east. They reach a place called Secret Pass, which is around Elko, Nevada, on May 16th, and they get in an argument. Greenwood wants to go on Fort Hall. He says that's the route you should go. Hastings has hired Clyman and Hudspeth and wants them to go through this route south of the Salt Lake City. So now finally, Hastings is actually traversing this route that he's talked about. And on June 7th, they reach Fort Bridger. From there, Hastings goes on east into the South Pass and starts talking to everybody he can find. Hey, I've got this shortcut. You need to take it. It's better, because he's trying to get people to California to support a revolution. And the story he's telling them is, when you get there, you're going to face the Mexican government and they're going to turn you away. And we need to go en masse to prevent that. And what we do actually hear, and here's an example of J. Quinn Thornton writing in 1848, one of the stories that one of the pioneers told him, talking about a much nearer and better route than the one via Fort Hall, with abundant supply of wood and water and grass, the whole line of the road, except for one dry little drive of about 35 miles, 40 at most. So he was advertising this as much as he could, leveraging Fremont's name. Clyman goes on up to the Sublet Cutoff, and then he meets Greenwood there, and they head on to Fort Laramie. And then on June 27th, another meeting, a fateful meeting, may have occurred. And this is where James Fraser Reed of the Donner Reed Party, so I'm sure you've heard of the Donner Reed story. It was known as the Donner Party because George was elected captain, but really James Fraser Reed was the de facto captain making the decisions. But he meets James Clyman, and supposedly they have a meeting and Clyman tells him not to take this route. Now, Clyman relates this in 1871, 25 years after the actual meeting. And as we know, people who were attached to significant events may tend to bolster their own importance. So we really don't know if that meeting occurred or not. Another event occurs is that Edwin Bryant and William Russell, who are the Bryant-Russell Party, have been thinking about this, hearing these stories, and they make a decision, a fateful decision. They decide to trade their wagons for mules and decide to take this route with pack mules instead of wagons. And then one last fateful event occurs. Remember Caleb Old Greenwood, he's heading east. I think he's actually going to finally get his children and bring them west. Joseph Walker, remember him? Giles Walker Party, Walker Path. He's driving 500 head of cattle back east to sell to the U.S. Army. And with him is Solomon Sublette, who's been through this whole territory. In fact, Clyman has been through this whole territory. He actually circumnavigated the Great Salt Lake in a boat, trying to discover the river to the west. So on July 18th, Edwin Bryant meets with Joseph Walker, and Walker says, do not take this route. It's not worth it. In fact, Walker had led Fremont's party through that route just the year before. Don't do it. This prompts Edwin Bryant to write the infamous letters that he is going to warn all of the people behind them not to take this route. and he supposedly leaves them at the fort, and the story is that Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez hid those letters and didn't give them to the pioneers because they didn't want to lose their business. Remember, the sublet cutoff had gone across, no motivation for people to come this way. They needed a new route. That's unsubstantiated, and I personally don't believe that Jim Bridger would have done that. That's just my opinion. But we don't know where those letters ever ended up. So, regardless of all those warnings, the parties show up at Fort Bridger, which was built in 1843 by Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez. The Donner Reed party arrives on 7/28. By this time, the other parties have already been there and left. One of the things you know about the Donner Party is they were slow. They left late, they were slow on the trail, they were unorganized, they argued, they were just a disaster. But they arrive on 7/28, and even the Hoppy Party has left by 7/26. So on July 31st, the Donner Reed Party heads out across what's known as the Hastings Cutoff. Now to look at this, there's really kind of 5 sections to it. We're going to look at 2. One is the Wasatch Mountains, one is the Great Salt Desert. On August 5th, the Donner Reed Party enters Echo Canyon. So I'm going to show you a map here. And if you look at this map, you'll see the 2 canyons coming in from the right, Echo and Lost. You'll see the Weber, or which was the Weber River, going northwest. You'll see the East Canyon going up the middle. And then you'll see those 3 red points. One is known as Devil's Gate, one is known as the Upper Weber Canyon, and the other is Big Mountain. And then that blue mark over there is important. So in June, Hastings and Kleiman come through this, head up through the Wasatch Mountains, the main canyon, and through Echo Canyon. And by all practical thought processes, when he's going to lead people back through this cutoff, he's simply going to reverse that path and lead them through. He's been through it. It's rough, but he knows about it. So that's what you would think would have happened. Here's what actually happened. The green dots are the Bryant Russell Party on their mules. They come in through Lost Creek. Based on some advice from some Native Americans, they go to Main Canyon and go up the East Canyon, at one point describing that they're on a Indian horse trail about 3 feet wide, about 300 feet up on their mules. And they get to Devil's Gate. They wait there. James Hudspeth goes on forward, then he comes back and he meets the Harlan and Young parties at that blue arrow. And he says, oh, that route's not too bad. Follow the river on up that way. It'll take some work. You got to maybe get off the river here and there, but you can make it. So they head out. The Mathers family comes behind them. They head out up the river. The Hoppy Party comes behind them. They head up the river. So what was it that gave them problems? This is Devil's Gate that we were talking about, that they had to go through. The problem was this was extremely, extremely rugged territory. And in fact, at points, they had to build windlasses and lift their wagons up to paths above the river. And at one point, they had a wagon that they were holding with ropes. One of the ropes came loose, the wagon and the team of 6 oxen fell 60 feet to the riverbed. James Mather of the Mather family would come up behind them, and he would describe this in his journal as an exhibition of consummate folly. So they're struggling through this, and then where's Hastings in all of this? Well, he's back east, trying to find a different route into the Wasatch Mountains. He comes up, he finds what's going on, and he's like, this is not what I intended. He goes back to that blue era, and he leaves a note for the Donner Party. The Donner Party comes in on August 5th, I'm sorry. They find that note which says, camp at the main canyon, get on your horses, come forward and find me. I'll come back with you and show you the route to take, which is that route through the Wasatch Mountains. James Fraser Reed, a couple other guys get on a horse, they race forward. They find Hastings over by the Great Salt Lake. Do get him to come back. They camp at Salt Lake City. They go to that big mountain that you saw on the map. And Hastings basically says, well, if you take this route and you kind of go through this canyon, and you can make it. And then he leaves. He reneges on his promise to take them through the path that he just suggested. This is the Wasatch Mountains that they had to go through. This is very rugged. There are peaks in the Wasatch Mountains as high as 12,000 feet. In fact, there are 30 peaks in the Wasatch Mountain over 11,000 feet. It's very wooded, very rugged. And the Donner Reed Party, who are joined by the Graves Party, will spend 11 days hacking a path through the mountains. Now, believe it or not, this is the path that the Mormons will use just a year later. So their efforts weren't in vain. But on August 22nd, they exit the Wasatch Mountains. They head over to what's known as Skull Valley around the 28th to the 30th. Now, a couple of events have occurred here. John Hargrave with the Harlan Young Party dies, and he's buried along the trail. And then young Luke Halloran with the Donner Party. You may have heard this story that Tamsin Donner took in this young man who was suffering from consumption or emphysema and nursed him. Unfortunately, he died in Skull Valley, and they would bury them side by side, and their graves have never been discovered. Also in Skull Valley, Tamsin Donner would find a note on the ground that's been torn apart by, they believe, by birds or crows. And she would painstakingly piece this note back together. And it said, 2 days, 2 nights, hard driving, cross desert, reach water. And this was left by Lansford Hastings. So they know they're up against something pretty dramatic. On August 31st, they reach the base of what's known as Hastings Pass in the Cedar Mountains. Skull Valley and the Cedar Mountains were very desolate, very, very barren. Horrible place. Brackish, alkaline water, no grass, tumbleweeds, sagebrush, scorpions, maybe the occasional coyote. To give you an idea of how bad this place was, we're going to back up a little. On August 3rd, Edwin Bryant, remember that guy I told you about, the journalist? He's recording a daily journal. It's amazing to read how much he wrote about every day. And he's recording his thoughts as they're sitting at the base of the Cedar Mountains, waiting to cross to go over the Great Salt Desert. And I'm going to share his thoughts with you.
Our encampment was on the slope of the mountain, and the valley lay spread out at our feet, illuminated sufficiently by the red glare of the moon, and the more pallid effulgence of the stars, to display imperfectly its broken and frightful barrenness, and its solemn desolation. No life, except in the little oasis occupied by our camp, and dampened by the sluggish spring, by excavating which with our hands we had obtained impure water sufficient to quench our own and our animals' thirst, existed as far as the eye could penetrate over mountain and plain. There was no voice of animal, no hum of insect disturbing the tomb-like solemnity. All was silence and death. The atmosphere, chill and frosty, seemed to sympathize with this sepulchral stillness. No wailing or whispering sounds sighed through the chasms of the mountains, or over the gulfy and waterless ravines of the valley. No rustling zephyr swept over the scant dead grass, or disturbed the crumbling leaves of the gnarled and stunted cedars, which seemed to draw a precarious existence from the small patch of damp earth surrounding us. Like the other elements sustaining animal and vegetable life, the wind seemed stagnant and paralyzed by the universal dearth around. I contemplated this scene of dismal and oppressive solitude until the moon sunk behind the mountain, and object after object became shrouded in its shadow. Edwin Bryant. August 3, 1846.
I don't think I would want to go camping there personally. That was a pretty desolate place. So about 4 o'clock in the morning, they break camp, start loading up, getting ready to go over the mountains. And they head up to the summit of the Cedar Mountains through what's now known as Hastings Pass. And this is what they see ahead of them. Now at this point, James Hudspeth and the two guys that are with him are decided to go back because this is as far as they have agreed to take the Bryant Russell party. So they get on their horses and they head back. And as they're riding away, James Hudspeth, Hudspeth turns back over his shoulder and yells back, "Now boys, put spurs to your mules and ride like hell." The problem was hell was 65 miles wide. And this would become known as the long drive across the Great Salt Desert. And it was marked by extreme heat and cold, searing heat during the day. At night, James Fraser Reed had to put the 5 family dogs next to his children to keep them warm during their 5-day ordeal. Thirst and dehydration. They barely had enough water for themselves, much less their oxen, who would just simply lie down and die. Blinding dust and salt storms. They talk about how the salt would actually cake on their faces. It was so brutal. Confusion. At one point, Edwin Bryant and William Al Russell looked out and they saw this glimmering lake ahead of them. And they thought it was the Great Salt Lake. And it turned out it was a mirage. And they had almost turned south, thinking they were headed in the wrong direction. And if they had, that would have sent them directly through the Great Salt Lake Desert in the totally opposite direction. Hallucinations. At one point, they talk about these monsters in front of them that were waving their hands and mimicking everything they did. Turns out it was their shadows. Loss of oxen and livestock. The oxen just ran off. I mean, they were so delirious from lack of water that they left. James Fraser Reed would lose 36 in total. Wagons broken and abandoned. Heinrich Leonhard would talk about that the oxen were so crazed and so hot that they would try to get in the shadow of a wagon next to them. They would catch their horns in the wagon spokes and either break their horns off or break the spokes in the wagon wheels. James Fraser Reed would abandon his Prairie Palace car in the Great Salt Desert, and it would lie there for 150 years. Total exhaustion. As I mentioned, a lot of the oxen just stopped and died in their tracks. And then shattered morale. But miraculously, on September 4th, they make it across the Great Salt Desert, the Donna Reed party does, and they reach Pilot Springs. Now you would think the word spring would make this beautiful bubbling water. This was more alkaline water. It was just a little hole in the ground. They would rest and recruit their oxen here for several days, but significantly on the 3rd day, they awoke and they saw a dusting of snow in the mountains, an ominous sign of things to come. On September 26th, they finally make it to the Humboldt River. To put their journey into perspective, the Cooper Gregg party that was 4 days ahead of them at the Sublet Cutoff reached the South Fork Junction, this same point, on August 22nd, essentially a month ahead of the Donner party. So if they had taken the Fort Hall route, they would have been here a month earlier. So what were some of the dynamics at work? The Immigrant's Guide. A lot of historians believe, or a lot of maybe novelists believe, that James Fraser Reed poured over the Immigrant's Guide. There's no proof of that, but it did, I'm sure. Fremont's impact on Hastings, if they did have the meeting, I'm sure it did. The eastbound party's negativity towards California. When Kleiman and his group were coming back east, a lot of the party members were negative, and there was a belief that the pioneers headed west just simply dismissed anybody coming east and what they were telling them. Bridger's personal motives, I don't like to think Jim Bridger would have hidden those letters and put people's life at peril. The Donna Reed's party lack of leadership, overconfidence, or naivete. James Fraser Reed would write a letter to the Sangamo Journal in November of 1846, which was published by the journal. And in that letter, he would talk about that he believed the cutoff would save 350 to 400 miles. There was only a 40-mile stretch without water, and he thought he was only 250 miles from California, and he felt that Fort Hall was 650 to 700, so this is why they were going to take the cutoff. And then Hudspeth's miscommunication or ulterior motive. There are some believe that Hudspeth had his own desire to find a path from the Bear River down to the Great Salt Lake to help shorten it. And then Hastings. Was it simply a case of avarice or overzealousness or what? Believe it or not, it wasn't probably until 25 years later that infamy caught up with him. Most people, until they knew the whole story, didn't have that much bad to say about him. Before we leave the trail, we would be remiss in not talking about some of the women on the trail. Nancy Kelsey with the Bidwell Bartleson party was the only woman in that party that went over the Sierras. She was the wife of Ben Kelsey, and she carried her 1-year-old daughter, Ann, all the way from eastern Nevada to Mount Diablo. And she did it barefooted. She was the first white woman to reach California by overland trail, and she was only 18 years old at the time. Sarah Armstrong Montgomery Green Wallace, she was the wife of Allen Armstrong with the Stevens Townsend Murphy party. He would abandon her. She would marry Talbot Green, who was the infamous Paul Geddes from back east, who had absconded with bank funds. He left. She married Charles Sawyer Wallace, and she became a prominent citizen of the Palo Alto area. She had at one time owned the Mayfield Farm. She was an investor in the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad, and the reason we have the California Avenue Station is because of her. And she was also the first president of the California Woman Suffrage Educational Association. Tamsen Donner. She was described as a good, caring little woman and a good shot with a pistol. If they had just listened to her, she had horrible reservations about Lansford Hastings and tried to encourage her husband not to take that route. They should have listened to her. And then Mary Bolger Murphy. We didn't talk about her, but if you're familiar with the Mary Bolger, the Murphy family story from our museum, she was probably, her picture should be up next to Stevens Townsend Murphy. She should be up there too, because she organized things so well and was really a driving person. And I believe she's a reason for their success. So, did these people build the superhighway that I asked way back when? Seemed like a long time ago, right? I don't think they were the builders. I'd like to think of them as the surveyors. That they're the ones that hacked and slashed the way through the brush to create this path that would lead to this magnificent series of trail that from 1840 to 1869 would bring over 250,000 people west. Quick recap of some of the influential people in California. John Bidwell would go on to found Chico. The Murphy brothers of the Stevens Townsend Murphy party would found Murphy's and become very rich during the gold rush. Charles and Helen Murphy of the Stevens Townsend would found Stockton. Dr. John Marsh would develop Brentwood. Bernard Murphy would be a state assemblyman, twice state senator, and 3-time mayor of San Jose. Patrick Murphy would manage over 73,000 acres in San Luis Obispo. Murphys were wealthy landowners. Josiah Belden of the Bidwell Bartleson would become the first mayor of San Jose. Horace Martin and Mary Bolger Murphy would settle in Sunnyvale. John and Mary Murphy Miller in San Rafael. Joseph Childs would be influential in the development of Davis. And then our friend, John Augustus Sutter. I kind of liken him as the Time Person of the Year. You either like them or you don't, but you have to agree that they made a difference. And I kind of put him in that category. So, as we leave the trail, next time you're headed up to Truckee, you're going up there to ski, maybe to Tahoe or one of the slopes around Truckee, and you're looking at those beautiful snow-covered mountains. Maybe you're getting a little antsy. It's snowing. Gosh, I may have to put my chains on. Think about these people. They are on the 19th iteration of that first 100 miles I described way back when. And they've got another 100 miles to go to reach their new destination and the life they've chosen. I tried to think of some prophetic words, but I couldn't, so I just left it to David McCullough. They accomplished what they had set out to do, not for money, not for possessions or fame, but to advance the quality and opportunities of life, to propel as best they could the American ideals. And I think for the most part, that describes the majority of the pioneers. I promised you some reading materials. There is a list of this on the desk out there, so I'm not going to go through these in details, but these books describe the early California Trail very well. And if you're really interested in the first half of the 1800s, I would suggest Daniel Walker Howe's book, What Hath God Wrought? And if you're really interested in learning more about the Hastings Cutoff, I covered it at a very high level, but there is a video out on our YouTube channel for the museum that I go in a lot of detail on it. These books are very good. Heinrich Leonhard's book, Edwin Bryant kept a meticulous diary. Morgan in Overland in 1846, and then West from Fort Bridger by Corns and Morgan. I promised you, and hang in there with me. We're just about through. I'm going to, being a good Louisiana boy, I got to give you a little extra here. You probably can't really read this document, so I'll read the top of it for you. Signatures state where born, residence, and age of delegate, convened in General Convention on the first day of September 1849 at Monterey to frame a state constitution for California. And on this list, you'll see some pretty impressive names. Robert Semple, John Sutter, J.D. Hoppy, Thomas Larkin, the American consul, Mariano Vallejo, Vallejo, California. But if you look at a name right about third down, it's kind of hard to read, but you'll see this gentleman was from Ohio, and he lived in the Sacramento area. He's about 30 years old. And it's none other than our friend Lansford W. Hastings. If you're ever wondering why the eastern boundary of California exists where it does, he chaired the committee to set the boundaries of California. And it's believed, as we know, that you didn't want to split the gold out of California, right? So they at least made it in the Sierras. It's also believed that he wanted it farther west to pay homage to the Mormons, who he would try to negotiate even more with later. But Elijah Crosby would reference him as quite a frontiersman. Considerable knowledge of the geography of the country, was much service to the body. And now he lives in infamy. So, you ever think about how they kept up with how far they were going? Remember earlier when we were talking about every kid had a job? If you were a little boy on the trail, your job was likely to keep up with how far you've traveled. And the way they did that was they would give him a pocket full of rocks, and he'd put them in one pocket, and then they would tie a ribbon on a wagon wheel, and he would count the rotations. And every time he reached 100 rotations, he'd move a rock to the other pocket. And when he moved all his rocks, he would hand one to the next kid. Medicine on the frontier. We'll jump back a little farther, but we'll go all the way back to 1823 for this little example. Jedediah Smith. I know we've probably pretty much all heard of good old Jedediah. Ashley 100, famous explorer, trapper. He meets up with an old grizzly bear who doesn't like him. The bear takes Jedediah's head in his mouth, severely lacerates his scalp, and rips one of his ears almost completely off. James Kleiman, his partner there, reaches in his pouch. Remember, I told you what those old guys look like with their buckskins and their pouches. Reaches in that leather pouch where he keeps his chewing tobacco and the lead balls for his rifle and whatever else. And he pulls out his needle and thread. And he sews Jedediah Smith's ear back on for him. What's for dinner? Well, you know, if you're out on the plains and you're time for dinner, and you look around here and you think, well, there's no wood. How am I going to make a fire? Well, if you're a woman, your day started about 4 o'clock in the morning, and it usually involved this: gathering buffalo chips off the plains to make fires with. And then finally, to end our journey, how better to do it than with a good cup of coffee? I mean, I'm ready for one. I know you guys are. I appreciate you hanging in there with me. Remember back August 3rd, 1846, Bryant Russell Party, foot of the Cedar Mountains, ready to go over. They decide that their drink of choice for going over the Great Salt Desert is going to be coffee. They empty out a gunpowder barrel. They scoop the brackish water up with their hands and brew their coffee in a gunpowder barrel. Probably not an item you're going to see at Starbucks anytime soon. And with that, I thank you.